Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the public information session on the mixed use corridors, urban design guidelines. My name is Donna Hind. I'm a partner at the Planning Partnership, and I've been managing the process of developing the guidelines and managing the events that we've had where we've sought input from other groups in the city. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nicole from the city and ask Nicole also to introduce the others from our city staff team that are on the call. Oh, Mike.
Helps
There
if
you
I
go.
unmute myself.
Sorry,
Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for taking the time to attend the meeting this evening. We're really excited to introduce the new mixed-use corridor urban design guidelines. My name is Nicole Hutzlach. I'm the city's urban design supervisor, and on the call we also have Caroline, who's our manager of policy planning.
Yes.
Milan, who is a planner and policy researcher, and Megan Peck, who's one of our urban design planners. I'm going to provide a quick introduction, and then I'm going to pass it back over to Donna, who's going to take you through an overview of the guidelines and kind of the key content that we've prepared. So the city's new official plan provides the direction for staff to prepare urban design guidelines for strategic growth areas, including the major and minor mixed-use corridors. Staff have utilized the province's streamlined development funds, which were made available to the city in early 2022 to prepare the central area urban design guidelines. And once the deadline was extended, we expanded the project to include the rest of the strategic growth area, which includes the major and minor mixed-use corridors. Adoption of these guidelines, which we hope to have back in front of council in December, would achieve one of the many policy goals outlined in the new official plan. So the mixed-use corridor urban design guidelines is a municipal level planning document that provides direction to the community, including private and public developers, about the urban design objectives as identified in the official plan. It's a series of design statements and images that explain the city's desired design elements and qualities that will shape both the private and public realm. These guidelines effectively will replace the draft nodes and corridors and central area urban design guidelines, which were adopted or approved by council in 2018 and were the result of a 4-day design charrette and over 30 public consultation processes that the city undertook in developing the new official plan. So these guidelines will assist landowners in preparing development plans and will be used as a basis for early discussions with the development community and for internal capital projects to facilitate the evaluation of design decisions. It's intended to build on existing planning policies and provide clarity as to how to interpret those goals and objectives. This guideline provides clear direction as the type of built form that is desirable in the city, with a focus on 5 major arterial roads, including Lansdowne Street, Clonsilla Avenue, Chemong Road, Armour Road, and Water Street. So the guidelines support objectives relating to achieving the city's intensification targets, promoting sustainable development, enhancing the quality of life, and facilitating the efficient approval of development applications by articulating clear and consistent design expectations. So in developing these guidelines, like I said, we built on the consultation that was done as part of the new official plan and presented the first draft of these guidelines to council earlier this month. This is the second of 2 public information sessions, with the first being catered more to stakeholders, including developers and consultants that we frequently work with. These guidelines are intended to take the overarching principles and visioning statements in the OP and provide clear and concise direction to guide new development, as well as investment in the major mixed use and minor mixed use corridors. It's both intended to be used by developers and the city, but it's not the intention of these guidelines that each item or element presented in the guidelines would be applicable to every design or kind of capital project or private development. While these documents very detailed in some respects, at its core, it's designed to provide the flexibility needed to adapt to site-specific constraints, and it's an important planning tool that will help encourage and streamline development in the city. So while these guidelines are based on the official plan, which does have planning merit. These are not a regulatory guideline themselves, but they do reflect some of the statutory requirements in the official plan. And it's anticipated that they will help inform the comprehensive review of the zoning bylaw update. So I'll now turn it back over to Donna to kind of present us through the guidelines, and post meeting, if there's any additional questions for staff, I'd encourage you to go onto the Connect Peterborough page, and you can find both my email and Milan's email. We'd be happy to answer any further questions you might have.
Perfect. Thanks, Nicole. So everyone is seeing my screen correct? Yes? Okay, thanks, Milan. Okay, so let's get started. And like I said, I'm going to stop a couple of times through the presentation. So, and when you want to ask a question, you can put it in the chat box. You use the chat box function, or use one of the icons that says you want to ask a question. So I'll pause a few times. So building on what Nicole said in her words of introduction, the official plan identifies key corridors as strategic growth areas in the city's urban structure. And those strategic urban growth corridors are indicated in red and pink on the map on the screen. So the red ones are major corridors and the pink ones are minor corridors. These guidelines are intended to help the city make sure they're getting the highest quality of design along the corridors as they can. They build on the work that was done in 2018 that the planning partnership led, where we were in the city for 4 days and 4 long nights developing the framework for guidelines that were presented in 2018 and formed a bit of the foundation of the official plan. So what you're going to be seeing tonight builds on the guidelines that have already been adopted by council for the central area, and we carry any of them forward that are relevant to these corridors into this document that we're looking at tonight. So the guidelines are intended to help staff evaluate applications when they come forward. How well are they meeting the various guidelines outlined in this document? It's intended for city staff to use for their own projects to guide more detailed planning and design on streets and parks and trails. They're intended to provide greater clarity. We often hear, especially from the development industry and their consultants, just tell us what you're looking for. And so that's the intent of these guidelines. Clearly lays out what the city and council are looking for. They are inherently flexible. So it depends on having great conversations, great collaboration by very talented city staff team and an amazing suite of consultants you have already working in Peterborough. They reflect the best planning and design principles from our decades of experience developing guidelines like this. So really important to remember they're non-statutory statements. They're general rules and they're recommendations. So the foundation of the guidelines is based on a notion of compatible development. So they are intended to help develop projects that reinforce the desired future and existing character of neighborhoods along the corridors. They're based on a contextual approach that considers impact and relationships on the context. There is a definition in the city's official plan about what compatible development is, and it doesn't mean it's exactly the same or even similar to existing development, but it has to prove that there's no undue impacts from overlook and shadows and impinging the scale of new development on old development. So it has to prove that there's no impact on adjacent development. So we developed diagrams to illustrate various scales, various areas that you'd look at depending on the scale of redevelopment that's proposed. So if it's major or large scale redevelopment, as on the left of the screen, this light blue area, the dark blue is suggesting that site is being redeveloped. And so you would consider the impacts within this large blue area to make sure that development that's being proposed is indeed compatible with with everything within that light blue area. If it's more minor redevelopment, so you can see exactly the same map that we're looking at, But when it's more minor, we're looking at several blocks in each direction. And if it's just redeveloping one house on a lot or an extension or adding some kind of addition, then it's just the immediate properties that abut that site. So it's really important that that scale of influence or influence area is responsive to the scale of development that's being proposed. Guidelines have 6 principles that are foundational, trying to make connections along the corridor and to key features and destinations off those corridors, to define gateways and entrances so the corridors take on a bit of their own special, unique character, that we make streets for people. So along the corridors now, it's very harsh environments for people that dare to walk on the sidewalks or ride their bikes. And so we're trying to make it a little bit more pedestrian and cyclist friendly, trying to make sure wherever there's views to significant places that they're protected, that we foster a unique sense of place on each one of those corridors, and that, like everything we do in Peterborough, that the projects are inclusive and equitable. So the mixed use corridor urban design guidelines, MUCUDG, have 5 main chapters, and I'm going to walk through each one of them individually, and then we'll pause. So we're going to talk about guidelines for buildings. We're going to talk about green infrastructure for buildings and public places. We'll talk about tree planting guidelines. We'll talk about street guidelines, and then guidelines for parks through redevelopment on the corridors. So just before I get into the content of the private guidelines, any questions, clarification required on those introduction, how it's set up, the purpose of the guidelines, the subject area of the guidelines? Okay. I'm going to push on. We're going to start with the private realm guidelines. So private realm guidelines is for guidelines for any development that's privately owned. So we look at recommendations for anything to do with the building, where it's located, placed on the site, what its height is, how bulky is it, where are signs, what special features could you add to define landmarks. We look at a whole suite of recommendations for the site. Where do you access parking lots? How is that site serviced? How is it landscaped? Where might public art be located? We have specific direction for specific building types like townhouses, stacked townhouses, mid-rise, higher rise, commercial buildings, automobile focused uses, drive-ins. These are the kind of buildings we're anticipating will evolve along the corridors over time. And I'm gonna give you, I just see a question in the chat box about how the guidelines are flexible. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples along the way, and we'll show you how they're flexible. And then in this section, we have specific considerations for the various corridors where they have specific conditions or characteristics that are worth responding to in the guidelines. So I'm going to walk through the recommendations for building placement and orientation. So the reason why we pay special attention to building placement and orientation in the guidelines is because that is one of the biggest components of defining the character of the street. So if we can start to define these big roads with buildings as opposed to large swaths of parking lots, it changes the character of the street. So wherever possible, we're wanting to bring the building as close to the street edge as we can. The height then is another tool that can help reinforce the character of that street edge and make a more appealing street experience. So we're looking for opportunities to add some consistency of height and mass of buildings along those corridors as they evolve over time. The street wall. So we're defining what the street wall is. So it's the front of the building. We're recommending that there be a 2-story minimum, that above 4 stories, the building would step back. And so that's so the building, the taller buildings don't impinge their scale on the sidewalk and people walking on that sidewalk. So it helps make a more appealing environment on the sidewalk. We want the building facades to be articulated so that it adds some interest to the sidewalk. So we don't want just blank concrete block walls that are slammed up to the edge of the sidewalk. We want there to be windows and doors and some articulation in materials along that facade. For site access, let me go back to transition. So we are particularly mindful when the corridors, the frontage on the corridors redevelop, that many times they abut residential neighborhoods or other neighborhoods. And so we want to make sure that there's a transition, especially if there's higher density on those corridors, to the adjacent neighborhoods. And so we're applying a tool called an angular plane, where it helps shave the building back, especially on the back, so that there's a gentler transition to buildings that are often of a lower height. And so you can see this photograph where the building is stepping down, and that's where it's transitioning to an adjacent neighborhood with lower buildings. The guidelines address where driveways come in, where parking is located, because as I mentioned, parking is the single biggest element that destroys the character along a street for people that are walking and cycling. Often if there is higher density development, there might be new forms of open space. And so some of that new open space can be shared amenity outdoor areas. So we want to give some direction for that. And lighting, fully integrated in the development, be dark sky friendly, make a positive contribution to the character. So when we look at the corridors on Peterborough, this is typical of the kind of condition. They've evolved through the 50s and 60s. We had completely different priorities than we do today, when completely different pressures than we do today, where the city is trying to accommodate new, more people and a different form of development and have a more urban character on these roads. And so we look across all of Southern Ontario, and every municipality that we're working with is struggling with the same thing and putting together direction that can guide the long-term evolution of corridors like in Peterborough. So when I drive around Southern Ontario and I go to places like Richmond Hill and Markham and Guelph and just about everywhere we work, we're looking at their similar conditions along their big streets. And over time, over the past, especially over the past 10, 15 years, seeing a completely different character of development on those streets, where their guidelines are providing direction for buildings to come closer to the street, to have clearly defined sidewalks. This is the top photo, is an early stage of construction. So the streetscape hasn't gone in, but you can see the difference in the character of the street when a building like that contributes windows and articulation of the facade and a 3-story building. And the one on the bottom, same thing. This is a different kind of use. It's commercial on the ground floor and office above. Large green swath along the street. You can see parking, access to parking is cinched in, and it's internal to the block and in the back, so that these buildings can come out to the street edge. Put this one in, which is I took a screen capture from Google Map in Markham. So this is Highway 7. They're equivalent to any one of the big roads in Peterborough. And this is plan view of a development on Highway 7. And so I'm just marking out where the buildings are along Highway 7. And what's intriguing for me on this photo too, when I looked at it a second time, is all the green roofs. And that's a kind of thing that can be recommended in the guidelines. So to Patricia, who's asking for an example of how they're inherently flexible, that's a flexibility. Could you provide a green roof? We're not requiring it, but is there an opportunity to add a green roof on your building? So then when I go down to street level and I look what that plan looks like when I'm a pedestrian on the sidewalk, this is what's revealed. So there's residential buildings, so not all buildings have to be mixed use, but taken together in this node, there's a mix of uses. So there's residential uses with some commercial at grade. You can see the attention to streetscape with the young trees that have been planted, the sidewalk, clearly defined sidewalk. In some portions, there's a painted path on the road for cycling. So it is just demonstrating the evolution of a different kind of character on those big streets. When we look, sorry, I want to go back. So I want to share an example of the city already applying the guidelines in its early iteration. So this is a development application they got for a site on Lansdowne. This was the first plan that came in by the consulting team. It had residential buildings that were perpendicular to the street. It's got parking along the street. Lansdowne is at the bottom of the page. It's got parking along the street. They really rightfully so showed a clear sidewalk that was lined on both sides with street trees. They have parking across the back, which sometimes doesn't make a great transition to adjacent uses. And then their open space is centralized as well, along with parking. The city staff worked collaboratively with the consulting team, and this is a quote from the consultants for that developer, not the city staff, that the evolution of this plan that I'm going to talk about in a minute, they said, is a direct reflection of the efforts of the developer, the consultant team, and staff that they made to work together to develop a different iteration of the plan. And this is what we fully anticipate. We know that there's some fantastic consultants in Peterborough and some willing developers, and again, great staff that work for the city. And so there's no reason to doubt that this can't happen again and again as plans come forward. So what you see, what the difference in the plans were is that one of the buildings was cranked a bit so that there's more street frontage, that they bring out a piece of urban square along the street edge, that they continue to show this great landscaped swath along the sidewalk, but there's no parking in front of the building. So the parking is consolidated on the side, in the middle, on the side. And at the back, instead of parking that butts up against the fence, and oftentimes in other situations, this would be adjacent to single detached residential. So instead of parking, that's where the green space is consolidated. So it's a terrific example of exactly what we're looking forward to happening again and again and again as developers bring their plans forward. So I'm going to stop for a minute. I see there's a question about slowing down traffic, and I'm going to talk about streets in a couple of minutes in another chapter of the guidelines. So are there any other questions specifically about the private realm guidelines? Anything that didn't make sense? Anything that we can help explain further? Okay.
So I see Joanne actually in the chat just asked if she could unmute herself and ask her question. So Joanne.
Oh, sure. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. I can talk quicker than I can type sometimes.
Yes, please.
Donna, a question for you. With pulling buildings closer to sidewalks, I mean, it looks beautiful, but what I've noticed quite often in a commercial application when they do that is in our winter situation, a lot of salt is used on sidewalks. And quite often what you see is that the bottom portion of the building will deteriorate really quickly because of the salt that's used in the winter. So that's one of the things that I would make a comment on, is that the more we pull a building close to the sidewalk, and especially if there's no break between the sidewalk and the building, and if it's a public sidewalk that's not on the commercial private part, then the city goes along, or will have to go along and plow the snow. So two things: where does the snow go? Up against the building, And like I said, the second thing is the application of salt. And you don't have to go very far in Peterborough to some of the commercial plazas and see where the bottom part of the building, the brick facade, is totally disintegrated from the salt. So that would be one comment. I mean, it looks pretty in the summer. And the second one, with pulling a building close to the sidewalk, I can think of an intersection in Peterborough that's an old intersection. It would be the intersection of Lock Street and Lansdowne. And on the southeast corner of that intersection, there's a building that's right up to the sidewalk. And at that intersection is totally blind for cars and for pedestrians crossing through that intersection because the building is way too close. So is that taken into consideration too, that if it's at an intersection, the building would actually sit back to give proper sight lines?
Absolutely, absolutely. That's something that the urban design team at the city deals with regularly. Nicole, I don't know if you want to weigh in on that because you probably deal with this on almost a daily basis when you're reviewing applications.
Yeah, I can jump in. So typically these developments, they're going through what's called site plan approval, and we'll review that. We do have updated engineering design standards now that speak to specific site triangles at the corner. So what you're speaking to, so that the building can still be brought forward to the street, but that it's not interfering with sight lines for both pedestrians and vehicles, because I do know the specific building you're talking to, and it is very close. And I don't know if that's the best implementation of the urban design principles that we're discussing here, because I agree with you that it didn't allow enough space for public realm and pedestrians even in that corner. So I know you have the curb drops up and down. And if you are a pedestrian kind of looking to stay consistent and walk from Lansdowne and turning onto Lock Street, there is a dip in the walkway. So for example, on that specific site, I would have liked the building to be set back even a meter or two. And maybe a lot of the times, if in historic downtown, more central areas, we see buildings on the corners having an angle, like an angle to this corner to allow for those sight lines. And that's something that we would encourage if there's a smaller development site. This example here is mid-block, so it's less of a concern, but certainly I think since that Lock and Lansdowne building has gone up, our engineering design standards have been updated, and we do have site triangles that our engineers are reviewing on every application.
Okay,
Thank
thanks.
you.
Thanks for that, Joanne.
And Nicole, do you understand what I'm saying about the salt? Like to me, it's a big issue. We use a lot of salt in the city of Peterborough on the sidewalks, which is necessary, but it does corrode and eat away at foundations and brick facades.
So I think it would have to be the material. Some of it's an older historical brick. It might be more porous and more susceptible to salt damage. I haven't heard of the recent buildings, but I can certainly look into this, and that's something we can consider further. Do you have an example?
Yeah, I can give you two examples in commercial properties in Peterborough that are not that old. Where Winners is, if you walk along that sidewalk as if you're going into Winners, you will see at the bottom it's all deteriorated. The same as you know where the Starbucks is on Lansdowne, the drive-through one right near Public Works, not the Starbucks, but the building that is now, I think there's a home building center of some sort in there. The same thing happened on that building, and that building's not that old, but again, and those are commercial properties where the private owner has put salt down on the sidewalks, and the sidewalk goes right up to the property, and they have deteriorated very quickly. I mean, it's beautiful. It looks beautiful when they're new, but the salt does affect.
Yes. So I think that's something we'll look into, and maybe we can consider it through planning applications, is a material that's a bit more salt resistant to, for a skirt around the base of the building. That's certainly something that we can have those discussions with developers, and I'll look at those specific sites you've recommended. We do have another question from Marilyn asking about
the guidelines
underground
about
parking.
heating.
So
Okay,
I don't know if I can quickly touch on that. So this is there a reason why Peterborough doesn't tend to use underground parking lots? Typically, in order to make underground parking feasible, you need to have your land values be of a certain height so that it's more economical for developers to build underground, which is typically more expensive than surface parking. So in somewhere like Toronto, where you have higher land values, they can get to those higher building heights, densities to make the economics of their development work to facilitate underground parking. And I think as Peterborough starts to grow, our land values increase and we support taller buildings and increased intensification, we'll be seeing more underground parking in the newer developments. This proposal that's in front of you actually is proposing some underground parking.
And then the question about the district heating, we're going to get into green infrastructure and building guidelines right now. So maybe your question will be answered with this part, this chapter. So this chapter, like I said, green infrastructure and green buildings, guidelines for that. We're looking in this chapter at buildings and sites, energy conservation, water use and management, air quality, bird-friendly design, materials, and solid waste, and urban agriculture. So the kinds of guidelines that are included in this chapter are intended to promote innovative programs to encourage design and construction of green buildings and sites to meet the city's goals. And so these examples of photographs that you're going to see on all the slides where we talk about the content of the guidelines illustrate precedents for that type of condition. So green walls, solar panels, water use and management. We're looking at reducing impervious surfaces wherever possible so that more stormwater can be absorbed, reducing and treating runoff to protect the natural water courses. So down on the bottom right, this is an example of specific street scape planting that is functioning almost as a drainage swale, capturing rainwater, porous and permeable paving stones. Energy conservation, we're looking at opportunities wherever we can to generate on-site energy to reduce the GHG and replace energy sources with renewable energy. The guidelines speak a bit about air quality. They talk about bird-friendly design by considering light pollution. We talk about material resources and solid waste. We're looking at when development applications come forward that they have an idea of how they're going to maybe reuse materials that are already on the site. And urban agriculture, such as community gardens, wherever there's an opportunity to incorporate community gardens into parks and public spaces. That's a terrific use for green space, and it can often be a great transition between uses. That's just a quick summary of what we have in the green infrastructure and green buildings chapter. I'll just give it a second to see if anybody's raising a hand or putting something in the. So a question in the chat box: how will the programs to encourage green buildings, net zero, be developed and when? So maybe Nicole or Caroline, is that a question? Do you have guidelines for achieving net zero?
Yeah, I can briefly touch on that. So that's kind of extending a bit beyond this guideline. While we do touch on it, we are kind of encouraging it. This is certainly not the document that's going to prohibit or require. It's not forceful statutory requirements, as we talked about. One of the things that has kind of I found interesting in recent legislative changes is that they're discussing incorporating green building standards directly into the building code, because they feel like that is the most, I guess, productive and useful tool they have to kind of grow Ontario in the more green building standards. So I think that's something we'll be keeping our eyes on. And we certainly have others in both the building department and in our engineering department who are looking at other tools to implement net zero buildings. I do know a lot of our city projects, there is specific funding tied to net zero. So I believe the new fire hall, that will be a net zero funding, and we were able to utilize, I believe it was, I don't know if it was provincial or federal, but it was some funding mechanism that by building net zero, we were able to get additional funding increases. So typically for green buildings, it's better to encourage and incentivize versus prohibit, other types of development.
Thanks, Nicole. Okay, let me push on to now talking about the tree planting guidelines. And while we were preparing these guidelines, city staff were also doing a separate document to update the city's tree planting guidelines for across the city. So we were working in tandem with the direction they were developing for the city's own tree planting guidelines. So in the mixed use corridors, we're looking at the urban forest as a system, the species that we're selecting, where trees are located and how they're spaced, where they're spaced, the special soil is required, the planting typology details, specific planting in natural areas or along the water's edge, and then recommendations for tree preservation. With respect to the urban forest, the guidelines are intended to promote the principles of biodiversity and growth rate stratification when selecting tree species. So we want variety. The intent is to establish a resilient urban forest with a diversity of species. And we know that this is a priority for the city, where the guidelines address species selection, the intent to avoid monoculture plantings. The tree species selection intended to support the potential for mature trees so that the trees are going to be healthy from the point from which they are planted well into maturity. The importance of the soil composition and volume to health, and the way landscape architects and arborists plant trees now is completely different than it was even 10 years ago. The planting typology, the use of structural soil cells to make sure there's sufficient volume. The details, like I mentioned, the city's been doing a terrific job updating their citywide tree planting guidelines. So they've got a terrific amount of detail in that document that our work cross-references. There's some recommendations specific to a particular landscape types, whether it's in and around a natural area or along the water's edge of the river. Tree preservation, obviously all opportunities to preserve trees are looked at early in the approval process, that the value is appraised, and that the preservation is based on identifying the critical root zone and protecting it through construction. I believe, yeah, that's the end of the tree planting. I see we have a couple of questions in the chat box. Province changes to our OP. Are these affecting the guidelines? And can we include wider scope in the guidelines than permitted now? Not sure, Nicole, if staff have really had a chance to digest the changes that came out this week.
Yeah, I can speak to that. So right now, what the province has announced, our understanding is it's just looking at the just over 60 modifications that they made. From a brief high-level look, as Donna said, we haven't dove into it deeper, but I know previously when those modifications came out and we were in the process of adopting the central area urban design guidelines, we did review them and there was no kind of material changes that would implement these guidelines. Certainly we have 45 days to get back to the province and review and present the city's position on that new information. So in doing so, we will be reviewing these guidelines and making sure that there's no modifications required, but we don't believe that to be the case at this moment.
And then in terms of climate resilience, I know that's something that came up during the official plan process.
Yeah, so there's policies in the official plan that encourage climate resilience. Again, it's not something that's covered in detail in this document, but it's certainly a consideration. Again, it's something I would be looking I think the city would be looking to incentivize and encouraging. It's not something right now under the current Planning Act legislation that we can require through, say, site plan approval or other planning approval processes. But as we develop more policies, there may at some point be statutory requirements, or there may be incentives that the city will put forward. The climate action plan is also currently being updated by the city, so we would look to that document to further inform climate resilience considerations.
Okay. And then the question about reference to tree species. The city's document that they were doing in tandem when we were doing our work is called Tree Planting, Installation and Establishment and Recommended Species List for Street, Park, and Site Plan Trees. So they've got they've done quite a lot of work on identifying suitable species for various locations. Okay, let's push on to the street guidelines. So for each one of our corridors, we have first started off with some general guidelines that address many of the same component parts that we did for the central area urban design guidelines, from identifying areas of pedestrian priority, the need for street furniture, the role of cycling facilities and lighting. But in the end, we also include street specific guidelines. So we've gone through, I think we've done 13 different, looked at through 13 different sections on the corridors, on the mixed use corridors. So we start with a fundamental notion of complete streets that's recognized in the city's own transportation master plan, that they're designed to accommodate all the users on the street, to make safe places for pedestrians, cyclists, all modes of travel, cars, buses, trucks, and how they can be designed as a complete and connected network. That the streets generally will be working hard to make sure that there's a clear zone for pedestrians along the sidewalk. That along that pedestrian zone, there's also a zone where trees are planted and often street furniture is placed. And if there are conditions along the corridor where there's adjacent street facing retail uses, that we look at opportunities to have a bit of a market zone along that building frontage. That pedestrian priority and walkability is a priority because of the harshness of conditions along most of these corridors. So wherever there can be clearly defined and identified crosswalks and crossovers, where there can be priorities for people to walk, where there's medians or spaces in the medians so that pedestrians can safely cross multiple lanes of traffic. One of the questions earlier on was, is there opportunities for traffic calming to reduce speed? And absolutely, and that will be done on a case-by-case basis as these roads come forward for more detailed planning and design. And I'm sure the urban design team and planning team is going to be looking at every opportunity to add additional landscape and add measures that might cause traffic to slow down a little bit. Cycling facilities so that they're clearly marked on the ground and identified through signage. Wherever street furniture can be accommodated, that it's added, benches, waste receptacles, bicycle racks, planters. That there's signage and wayfinding, especially along these big corridors where it's often very difficult to figure out where you are in the city and which way is to City Hall and which way is to Little Lake and how do I get to the mall and how do we get to Winners. And so signage and wayfinding really important at a scale that's suitable for some of these big environments. And not to forget the role of public art in helping to identify and mark these places as special and unique places. So this is an example of the cross sections that we developed. I think there are 13 in total, where we look at various segments of the street. And then we allocate the space within the public property, within the road right of way, for streets and sidewalks and sometimes mixed use path for cyclists and cars, and how travel lanes can be allocated within the real estate of the right of way. And sometimes we will be identifying locations where for trees that might be on private property, but that's where they can have a contribution to making the landscape along the corridor even better. So pause for a second on streets. Anything in particular on streets? So for cycling on roads, are there specific design guides for cycling infrastructure within the overall street design? So we make some recommendations for the location of cycling lanes, but that's going to come out of that will be further developed through the subsequent more detailed planning studies. And I know we've always had interesting conversations when it comes to cycling lanes on the street. So Nicole, I don't know if you want to weigh in a little bit.
Yeah, so I think through this project and the streetscape designs, we're looking, as Donna said, the ultimate right of way and how to incorporate sidewalks, mixed use pathways. But we would not get into the detailed design of bicycle lanes. For that kind of level of detail, I would kind of direct you to the transportation master plan, which the city has been working on concurrently. We've certainly coordinated this document with those working on the transportation master plan so that they are not conflicting and they are complementing each other. But that would be the document that would get into more specifics.
And Nicole, maybe you can help me answer the question from Sue about incorporating Indigenous languages in the wayfinding and signage in the city. I'm not sure if the city's developing a new protocol.
Yeah, so I don't think that's something that we've covered in detail in this document, but we've spoken to the importance of wayfinding. And then when those projects got to the detailed design stage, we would expect consultation, including that with our local First Nations, to kind of determine what languages are appropriate, symbols, locations. So that's something that I would expect to come out of the detailed design phase.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Sue. Let's just see this question from Sarah. Challenges with conflicting versus complementary with the transportation master plan, lane widenings continue, new parks with no bike parking. Yeah, that's, it's always worthy of lots of conversations when we get together with the transportation engineers and planners. And it is always about balancing competing interests and needs and wishes, and it really, every project is different, isn't it, Nicole? I mean, it's hard to say overwhelmingly you can do this or that, because there's so many specific things that the team has to consider with respect to every application, every road that's being improved. So I don't know if there's specifics you can share.
Yeah, I guess what I would say is specifically, I believe this question is kind of likely referring to Charlotte Street, as they mentioned, the Quaker Foods City Square. As I'm sure many on the call are aware, there is plans to redevelop that portion of Charlotte Street, which is in the central area. And that was kind of initially covered in the central area urban design guidelines. Because of the uncertainty with the bike lanes, and that decision is going to be presented back to council after there's further work done with the transportation planning team. We did elect to kind of keep that section of street out of the document. And you also, so it's not in this one as well, because there is some uncertainty, and that is specifically in that section of Charlotte Street, which is in the central area, and there is a much narrower right of way and higher competition for bike lanes, amenity space, multi-use pathways, if that's appropriate, sidewalks, where if you looked at something like Lansdowne Street East, we have a 36-meter ultimate right of way, and while there's more lanes of traffic, that also there is a larger amount of space to kind of accommodate more of the needs. So But as Donna said, these streetscapes and the sections that we've presented, they are conceptual, and these would be a representation of urban design best practices, transportation master planning best practices, and then that would inform part of the detailed design, where the city team would also be looking at our engineer design standards, certainly construction costs, maintenance costs. And at that point of the detailed design stage, it certainly becomes a balancing act of multiple competing priorities. And staff presents the best option, and then we ultimately go forward with council to make that decision.
Thanks, Nicole. All right, the last chapter of the document, park guidelines. So we look at introducing urban park types that were first introduced in the official plan. So it's a whole new hierarchy of, like I said, more urban character of parks. So along with community parks and neighborhood parks, in the official plan, they said with more urban forms of development, you're going to see more urban types of parks. So there's going to be urban community parks, urban squares, and there was one that was introduced in that example of a development application that I showed earlier, urban pocket parks, which are smaller, urban squares, urban parks, sliver parks, which may be wider green spaces on private property that function as public space, courtyards in buildings, and then connecting links, which could be green linear parks that connect one developed site to another developed site. And then we have general guidelines for parks in this section. So the general guidelines talk first about the context for that park and how that park contributes to the character of the development, that it will be well maintained, well lit, it will be animated with activities and programming. There will be placemaking that will reflect community-based efforts and activities to activate that space. The city has really thorough policy on accessibility, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and they worked with us all the way through this development of the guidelines to make sure that our recommendations were reflecting everything that was important with respect to accessibility, diversity, equity, and inclusion in the city's public spaces. Sustainability and resilience. So we want to make sure that our parks are doing whatever they can to mitigate against the factors for climate change. The importance of when we're introducing new urban parks, how they have to be designed within the context of all the development around it so that they make sense and they relate to the adjacent buildings, that there's windows and doors that overlook those urban spaces to keep them safe, and that those smaller urban spaces are part of a bigger system of urban parks in a new neighborhood. I mentioned the importance of programming, the flexibility, the variety of programming. One of the recommendations is about seating, to be open to considering a vast array of seating types in the urban parks. And along with seating, it can be picnic tables and waste receptacles and light standards and bike racks and a whole suite of elements that finds its location in urban parks. And I believe that is, I have one more. The role of lighting in our urban parks, make sure that they're safe and secure for people to use. Public art is a very important component often in our public spaces, and it can really contribute to creating a very special location in public parks, and that public art can be incorporated into paving, be incorporated into the design of street furniture, incorporated in the design of buildings. It doesn't have to be standalone installations. And then other features incorporated in parks like public washrooms that are obviously intended to support a whole range of activities. So I see, Joanne, you have a comment in the chat box, which is not really the topic of the mixed use corridors. I think this is going back to the central area urban design guidelines. So Nicole, I'm not sure if you want to weigh in.
Yeah, I can just
A little
provide a quick
back.
update. I don't
Okay.
have an exact timing of Charlotte Street at this moment, but I do know that there has been a request for our transportation team to look into the need for bike lanes, and then we'll be presenting that back to council, but I can't say the exact timing at this moment.
Okay. So Marilyn, is that they are only recommendations? What's the incentive for developers? Without the incentives, I fear that nothing will change and we'll be stuck in the 1960s. Well, maybe Nicole, you can talk about your recent experience with that example that I shared, which I think is such a good case study of what you can look forward to in Peterborough.
Yeah, so I think that's one of a really exciting project that's coming forward. Certainly, there are lots of different developers that we see applying for Planning Act applications that are constructing around the city. Some are very open to these guidelines, some are not. So there's also sometimes a staff priority to focus and work with those consultants that are kind of open to implementing the OP vision and the direction that the city wants to go in. Right now, we have meetings initially up front with the development and consulting team to kind of look at their original high-level concept and guide them and work with them to say, what are your priorities? How can we maybe make some alterations to the plan that still implement your goals and objectives for your project, but also align better with the city's overall vision for development? I think the project we kind of used as a case study earlier on is a really great example where we had a very willing group of consultants that wanted to work with city staff and implement the urban design best practices that we know to be true. Another really great example is the Y Lofts. It is in the central area, but I think that's a common project a lot of people are familiar with. Where there wasn't necessarily requirements, but there was adaptation and a willingness to adapt the original design to implement things like step backs, materials, articulation, enhancements to the streetscape. So all of those things right now, it's encouraging through development. Sometimes there's statutory requirements where if you're going through a zoning bylaw amendment process or an official plan amendment, the city can require things. Sometimes if it's just through site plan approval, it's recommending and trying to incentivize. One thing we are looking at is other urban design incentives that we can look at, whether that is urban design awards or actually city contributions similar to, say, our facade improvement grant, where if you meet these requirements, there is a kind of cash incentive towards your project and a contribution. So it's finding a balancing act, and part of that is having discussions with our development community about what it will take, I guess, for them to implement these policies in their ongoing projects.
All right. Terrific. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for giving us an hour and a bit to let us walk through the content of these guidelines. And it's really important to let your elected councillors and Councillor Parnell is on the call and participated in a session we had yesterday. And we know that council are interested in learning about the guidelines and what they can do and can't do. So it's really important, like you say, Marilyn, that you don't want to be stuck in the 1960s. So let your councillors know that, because they certainly hear from the development community. Important to hear from residents that say, wait, we don't want this to be like this forever. So really appreciate it. Nicole, do you want to say anything in closing?
Yeah, I would just like to kind of encourage everyone to go on Connect Peterborough, which I'm sure you already have been if you've joined this meeting. But if you haven't had a chance kind of to review the document in detail, I think there's a lot of really great content there. And if you have any questions or clarification, please feel free to reach out to Milan or myself. And as Donna mentioned, I think we'll likely be going to present this document back to council in December. So if you feel like, comments either way, constructive criticism, encouragement for these documents, it's always really important. And we appreciate the community's engagement in helping to kind of move forward with what we feel very strongly is kind of the vision of our community and what we heard through the official plan. So thank you all for taking the time this evening. Yeah.
Thanks a million. And I will end the recording on everyone's behalf.